On a remote and windswept ranch, nestled between endless fields of golden grass and towering mountains, a man known only as Ethan "Grizzly" Carter works in quiet solitude. Every morning, before the sun touches the sky, he's already feeding the horses, brushing their coats and walking among them like a shepherd among his flock. To the elite young riders from the prestigious Crestwood Equestrian Academy, he's just the old stableman, slow-moving, weathered, and stuck in his ways. They laugh behind his back, call him names, and question why the ranch owner keeps him around. But Ethan doesn't react. He listens, he observes. They don't know who he really is. At 65, Ethan Carter may look like a relic of another era, but those who dare look closely into his eyes can see it. The focus, the fire, the depth of a man who has faced storms far greater than arrogant teenagers and untamed horses. What they can't see is that he was once a legend, a Navy SEAL with a record of impossible missions, razor-sharp tactics, and a presence that could silence a battlefield. But now he keeps his past buried under a cowboy hat and a pair of dusty boots. One day, when a wild stallion throws off every rider and proves impossible to tame, the boys mock Ethan and challenge him to do better. They expect a joke, but Ethan accepts. What this old man is about to do will change everything. A forgotten warrior is about to rise in the most unexpected place. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe and follow this story of honor, skill, and resilience, because sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who says nothing at all. Greenwood Ranch sat on the edge of the Colorado Highlands, a place where tradition met modernity. It was both a working ranch and the seasonal training ground for riders from Crestwood Equestrian Academy, one of the nation's top institutions for elite youth in competitive riding. These students came from wealth, privilege, and ambition, and they arrived every summer thinking they knew it all. Among them was Chase Donovan, a confident 19-year-old with a smirk that rarely left his face, and a reputation as one of the Academy's top riders. His friends followed his lead, mimicking his arrogance, echoing his jokes, and turning their noses up at the quiet ranch hands who did the real work behind the scenes. Ethan "Grizzly" Carter was one of those hands. Every morning, he moved through the stables like clockwork, feeding, cleaning, tending to every animal with care. His movements were slow but deliberate, the kind that comes from years of experience rather than fatigue. The younger riders scoffed. They mocked his old flannel shirts, his faded jeans, and the way he never raised his voice. "Watch out," Chase joked one morning. "Grizzly might fall asleep mid-shovel." The others laughed, but Ethan didn't flinch. He kept brushing the mare in front of him, focused, calm. That week, a new horse arrived, a massive black stallion with fire in its eyes and no patience for anyone. It had thrown off every rider who dared mount it, bucked, kicked, and reared without mercy. The instructors were baffled. Even the Academy's top trainers couldn't make progress. The horse was declared untamable. Naturally, Chase saw it as an opportunity. One morning, as a group of riders and staff gathered to observe yet another failed attempt, the stallion stood inside the corral, stomping and snorting like a beast ready for war. One by one, the Academy riders tried their hand. None lasted more than 10 seconds in the saddle. Laughter echoed, jokes flew, frustration built. Then Chase turned, squinting toward the barn where Ethan leaned against a fence post, quietly watching. "Hey, Grizzly," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why don't you show us how it's done?" The other riders chuckled, nudging each other. Ethan didn't move. He adjusted his hat, eyes fixed on the horse. Chase pushed further. "Come on, old man. You've been watching long enough. You think you know better? Let's see you try." A hush fell over the group. No one expected Ethan to respond, but after a long pause, he stepped forward. He moved slowly, every step steady, like the ground itself was part of his rhythm. He didn't speak. He didn't boast. He just walked toward the corral and rested his hand on the fence, locking eyes with the stallion. The animal froze. The young riders watched, suddenly unsure if this was a joke or something more. Without a word, Ethan opened the gate and stepped inside. A few gasps echoed. Someone muttered, "Is he crazy?" But Ethan showed no fear, no rush. He simply stood still, hands by his sides, giving the stallion space. Minutes passed in silence. The stallion snorted, pawed the dirt, but didn't charge. And for the first time that week, it didn't bolt. "He's not gonna ride it," Chase scoffed. "He's stalling." But even Chase didn't sound convinced. Ethan finally turned and walked back toward the gate, the stallion watching him the entire time. He stepped out, closed the latch, and walked away without a word. "Was that it?" one rider asked, confused. Ethan paused just long enough to glance over his shoulder. "Patience," he said. Then he disappeared into the barn, leaving the others in stunned silence. That was the day the story began. The next morning, the tension on Greenwood Ranch was thick enough to cut with a blade. The usual laughter from the academy boys had quieted into murmurs and side glances. Everyone was talking about Ethan's silent encounter with the wild stallion. Chase Donovan wasn't laughing anymore. He met with his closest circle under the shade of the old water tower. Tyler Grayson, the unspoken leader of the group, stood with arms crossed. Tyler was older, sharper, and far more calculating than the rest. He came from old money and carried himself like it. Chase may have had flair, but Tyler had control. "Are we seriously letting that old man show us up?" Tyler said, his tone cold and precise. "He didn't even ride the horse," Chase muttered, defensive. "He just stood there." Tyler's eyes narrowed. "Exactly. And now people are whispering like he's some kind of horse whisperer." Across the ranch, Ethan was working like any other day, hauling feed, checking hooves, cleaning stalls. But now, every movement he made was watched. The ranch hands nodded respectfully. Even the instructors gave him space. Something had shifted. Later that afternoon, Tyler approached him directly. "You're not just a stableman, are you?" Ethan didn't stop his work. "Just doing what needs doing." Tyler scoffed. "People think you can tame that stallion. That true?" Ethan didn't answer. That was enough for Tyler. He rallied the group and made the challenge official. "You want to prove yourself, Grizzly? Then do it. Tame the stallion, ride it, train it, whatever it takes. We'll give you 1 week." The riders cheered, sensing a show. Ethan finally looked up. "Not everything's a contest, son." "It is now," Tyler snapped. "Or are you backing out?" Ethan stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll do it. My way." The boys erupted, some laughing, others betting against him. But Ethan didn't react. He turned and walked toward the corral again. This time he didn't step inside. He simply sat on the fence post, hands resting on his knees, watching the stallion graze near the far end. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just observed. The stallion glanced at him occasionally, but kept its distance. To the academy riders it looked pointless, but to Ethan it was the first step. As the sun dipped behind the hills, a faint breeze stirred the dust. Ethan closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in another time, another place. A Navy SEAL training ground. He was younger then, kneeling in the mud, his muscles burning from hours of silence and stillness. His instructor paced in front of him. "Patience isn't passive," the instructor had said. "It's controlled. It's active. You wait for the right moment. Not because you're afraid to act, but because you know when to." The memory faded. Ethan opened his eyes, still perched on the fence. Back in the present, Tyler shook his head. He's wasting time. But a few others were beginning to wonder. That night, as stars blanketed the sky, Ethan returned to the stables one last time. He stood by the stallion's pen, speaking softly. Not words, just presence. The horse didn't bolt, it didn't charge, it watched, and for the first time it didn't seem to mind. By midweek, the ranch was buzzing. Word had spread far beyond the academy students. Instructors, ranch staff, even neighboring ranchers began showing up just to see what the old man might do. Every afternoon they'd gather near the corral, waiting for a spectacle, but there were no theatrics, no sudden breakthroughs, only Ethan. Each day he sat on the fence post, still and calm, watching the stallion. Sometimes he brought a small piece of apple or whispered something only the horse could hear. He didn't rush, didn't force, and the stallion, once wild-eyed and violent, now stood closer. Not tame, not safe, but curious. Meanwhile, Tyler Grayson and his group were growing restless. "This is getting ridiculous," he snapped, pacing near the barn. "He's not even doing anything." Chase nodded. "He's playing mind games, that's all." So, they tried to take matters into their own hands. The group decided to demonstrate how a real rider handles a horse. One by one, they entered the corral with ropes, whips, and saddles, shouting, commanding, demanding obedience. The stallion fought harder than ever, rearing back, biting, kicking. Within minutes, the arena turned chaotic. Dirt flew. One rider hit the ground hard. Another barely rolled out of the way of a violent hoof. Ethan didn't interfere. He simply watched. When it was over, the stallion stood at the far edge of the pen, snorting and pawing the ground, more agitated than before. The riders limped out, bruised and silent. Tyler threw his gloves on the ground in frustration. "You think you can do better?" he snapped at Ethan, still breathless. Ethan stood and walked toward the gate. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He opened the latch, stepped inside, and just stood there. No ropes, no tools, just presence. The stallion lifted its head, tense, alert, but it didn't charge. Ethan took a step forward, then another, slow, purposeful. The horse took a step back, uncertain, but didn't flee. Ethan stopped, nodded once, then calmly stepped back and left the corral. "Is this some kind of game?" Tyler muttered. But others were starting to sense something different. Sarah Collins, a local journalist working on a story about youth programs in rural areas, had been visiting Greenwood that week. She watched from the sidelines, scribbling notes. There was something about the old man, his silence, his certainty, that stirred her curiosity. Who was this guy? That evening, she approached one of the instructors. "What's his story?" The instructor shrugged. "Ethan, been here a few years, keeps to himself, quiet but reliable." "No one knows more?" "Not really. Rumor is he's seen some things, but he never talks about it." Sarah's instincts kicked in. She decided to dig deeper. Back in the bunkhouse, Ethan sat alone on the porch, watching the stars. His weathered hands held a piece of rawhide, fingers absent-mindedly weaving it into a lasso. His eyes were calm, but distant, somewhere far from the ranch, lost in time. Inside the barn, the stallion was still restless, but no longer violent. It paced near the gate, glancing toward the direction Ethan had gone. Something had shifted. The young riders didn't understand it, but they couldn't ignore it. There was more to this old man than worn boots and quiet ways. Much more. Sarah Collins sat in the tiny coffee shop just outside town, laptop open, fingers tapping with practiced rhythm. Her curiosity about Ethan Carter had turned into a full-blown investigation. She wasn't the type to let a mystery go, and something about the quiet strength of that old man whispered of a story buried deep. She began with a simple search. Ethan Carter, Greenwood Ranch. Nothing, no public record, no social media. But then she remembered something, a passing comment from one of the instructors. "He's seen some things." She changed her search. Ethan Carter, military. That's when the pieces started falling into place. An article from 10 years ago. A declassified report. A blurry image from a Navy retirement ceremony. Ethan Grizzly Carter, former Navy SEAL, decorated veteran, recipient of multiple honors, including the Silver Star and the Navy Cross. A legend in tactical circles, credited with leading one of the most complex rescue operations in recent history. And then, nothing. He disappeared from the spotlight. Sarah's jaw dropped. This wasn't just a quiet ranch hand. This was a man who had seen combat, who had saved lives in silence and walked away without asking for praise. A man who had every reason to boast, but chose to say nothing. Back at the ranch, the young riders were still reeling from their failed attempts to break the stallion. Tyler paced by the stables, frustration growing, but Chase had heard whispers. "Hi, you guys, did you know Grizzly might have been some kind of Navy guy?" he said, barely above a whisper. Tyler rolled his eyes. "Please, that's just gossip. Old ranchers love spinning war stories." Chase didn't sound so sure. What if it's true? That evening, Sarah returned to Greenwood with a printed folder in hand. She approached Ethan near the stables, where he was quietly brushing one of the mares. "I know who you are," she said softly. Ethan didn't look up. "Do you? You're Ethan Carter, SEAL Team 6, Operation Black Tide. You saved 6 hostages under enemy fire." He stopped brushing. A long silence followed. Then he looked at her, his eyes deep with something unspoken. "I was a different man then," he said. "Why hide it?" she asked. "Because I came here to stop being that man." Sarah respected that. She closed the folder and handed it to him. "People deserve to know who you really are." He didn't take the folder. "No, they need to know who I am now, not who I was." The next day, word began to spread. Sarah hadn't published anything yet, but whispers ran fast among ranch hands and instructors. Soon even some of the riders heard it, rumors of a hidden past, of a man who had done great things without ever needing to speak of them. But Tyler wasn't convinced. He gathered the group. "You all seriously believe this garbage? A war hero living in a barn? That's not how the real world works." Chase didn't respond. Neither did a few others, because deep down they were starting to see it. The way Ethan moved, the calm in his posture, the way animals responded to him, the way silence wasn't awkward around him. It meant something. Even the stallion seemed different now. It no longer lunged at the gate. It paced slowly, ears perked whenever Ethan was near. That night, Ethan stood by the corral under a silver moon, the folder Sarah gave him still unopened in his hand. He stared at the stallion, then at the stars, then, finally, at his own reflection in the dark glass of the barn window. He wasn't hiding, he was healing. The sun rose over Greenwood Ranch, casting golden light over the dusty hills and wooden fences. But the morning air was charged with something different: anticipation. The stallion, once wild and untouchable, now stood calmly at the edge of the corral when Ethan arrived. It didn't bolt. It watched him with quiet curiosity. The young riders noticed. So did Tyler. He didn't like it. During breakfast, the dining hall buzzed with conversation. Chase sat silently, staring at his plate while the others debated the rumors. "I heard he was part of a mission overseas," one said. "They say he's killed people," whispered another. Tyler slammed his coffee mug down. "It's all fake. You think a real SEAL would end up cleaning stables for a living?" Chase looked up. "Maybe that's the point." Tyler glared at him but said nothing. Later that day, Tyler marched across the ranch and found Ethan alone, checking the straps of an old saddle near the stables. Without warning, Tyler stepped forward and confronted him. "You think you're better than us?" Ethan didn't look up. "I don't think about that. You walk around here like some wise old monk, letting everyone believe you're some kind of legend. I let them believe whatever they want." Tyler stepped closer, voice sharp. "Why don't you prove it? You're good with horses. Fine. But what about real pressure?" Ethan straightened and finally looked at him. "What do you want, son? A test, you and me. Show us what you can really do. I'm not here to impress anyone." "Of course not," Tyler sneered, "because you know you'd lose." The words hung in the air. Ethan didn't respond with anger. He simply tightened the strap he was working on, then turned to Tyler with calm eyes. "You want strength? Strength isn't in your arms or your ego. It's in knowing when to act and when not to." Tyler smirked. "Spoken like a coward." But before Ethan could answer, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Enough." It was Sarah. She had overheard the exchange and stepped forward, holding her phone. "You really want proof, Tyler? Here it is." She tapped the screen, showing the photo she had printed days before. Ethan in uniform, medals across his chest, standing beside a group of hardened warriors. SEAL Team 6. Tyler glanced at it, scoffed, and walked away. But the others had seen. Whispers turned to wonder. Later that afternoon, the riders gathered around the corral again, but this time, there was a hush in the air. Ethan approached the gate as usual. The stallion stepped forward on its own, meeting him halfway. Ethan didn't reach out. He just stood, and the horse came closer. Chase watched, then turned to Sarah. "Why doesn't he just get on?" "Because he's building trust," she said. "One day at a time." The silence was broken only by the sound of soft hoofbeats and the wind through the trees. After the session, Sarah caught up with Ethan by the barn. "Why don't you tell them the whole story?" He gave a soft smile. "Because if they only respect me for what I used to be, they'll miss the lesson I'm trying to teach them." "And what lesson is that?" He looked toward the corral. "That control isn't force, power isn't noise, and leadership starts with listening." For the first time, Sarah saw something shift inside him. Not pride, not grief, just peace. Tyler watched from a distance, still unconvinced, but the cracks in his certainty were beginning to show, because Ethan hadn't fought back, and somehow, that made him stronger than any of them could understand. The morning fog rolled in thick and heavy over Greenwood Ranch. The stallion was already at the fence, ears forward, eyes scanning the distance, waiting, and Ethan came. Every day now they met in silence. No rope, no reins, no force, just a connection slowly deepening. Riders and ranch hands watched with a mix of awe and confusion. How could an old man accomplish what they couldn't, and do it without ever raising his voice? But no one asked. They just watched. Later that day, as Ethan repaired a broken gate hinge near the back barn, a sound triggered a memory. A loud metallic clang, sharp and sudden. For a moment, time bent, and he was no longer in Colorado. He was back in the desert. His team moved silently through the narrow canyon, the heat oppressive, the air dry as bone. Dust swirled around their boots. It was a rescue op, high risk, the kind that could turn fatal with one wrong step. Civilians were being held inside a stone compound. Time was running out. Ethan led the charge, not with barking orders, but with steady eyes and calm commands. When the shooting started, chaos exploded. But he didn't flinch. He moved with precision, dodging fire, covering his men, clearing the path. And then he saw her, a child maybe 7 years old, hiding behind a wall of crates. He didn't hesitate. He dove forward, shielded her with his body, and carried her out under a hail of bullets. That mission made him a legend, but it also broke something inside. The memory faded. Ethan stood again at Greenwood Ranch, dust on his hands, a wrench in his grip. His breathing slowed. He had spent years trying to forget that day, but maybe now he could use it. That evening, as the riders gathered again at the corral, the atmosphere felt different. The stallion had begun following Ethan's movements, echoing his steps. It wasn't obedience, it was trust. Tyler stood off to the side, arms crossed, face blank, but his eyes betrayed him. Jealousy, fear, and something else, uncertainty. That night, Tyler paced his bunkhouse, stewing in silence. The others had started listening to Ethan's advice, asking him questions, showing respect. Even Chase had changed. He no longer laughed at Ethan. He watched him, carefully. And Tyler hated it. He wasn't going to be outshined by a relic. So, he made a decision. If Ethan wouldn't fail on his own, he'd give him a little push. The next morning, just before dawn, Tyler snuck into the corral and scattered small, sharp stones across the inner perimeter, right where Ethan typically stood. It was subtle, almost invisible, but enough to cause a stumble, enough to break trust, enough to humiliate. He returned to the bunkhouse before anyone saw. Hours later, as the morning session began, the usual audience gathered. Sarah stood with her camera, Chase leaned on the rail, the stallion watched the gate, and Ethan entered. He stepped inside, slow and steady, eyes on the horse. The stallion approached, nostrils flaring slightly. It sensed something but came anyway. Ethan took a step and paused. His boot shifted slightly. He glanced down, sharp eyes scanning the dirt. In one smooth motion he knelt and picked up a stone, then another, then another. He said nothing. He just looked up at the crowd, straight at Tyler, and kept walking. The stallion followed. Whatever trap had been set, it had failed. Tyler's face burned. Sarah, watching through her lens, whispered to herself, he knew. He always knows. By the end of the session, the stallion had nuzzled Ethan's hand. It was more than progress. It was transformation. That night, Ethan stood by the corral under the stars. He whispered a prayer of thanks, not for the victory, but for the peace that had started blooming inside him again. The warrior in him wasn't gone. He had just learned a new kind of battlefield. And he was still winning. The day had arrived. A week had passed since the challenge was issued, and the once skeptical whispers had turned into eager anticipation. Greenwood Ranch, usually calm and routine, now buzzed with energy. Everyone knew what was coming. The old man and the wild stallion face to face in a final moment that would settle every doubt. Even the ranch owner, Mr. Dalton, postponed his meetings to witness it himself. A few local families, having heard rumors of the taming, showed up with lawn chairs and coffee. It felt like a small-town rodeo, but quieter, more reverent. At the center of it all stood Ethan Carter. He wasn't dressed any differently, just his usual flannel, worn jeans, and battered boots. But there was something in his stride that commanded attention. He moved with purpose, like every step mattered. No swagger, no show. The corral had been freshly cleaned, the crowd positioned along the fence line. Tyler leaned against a post, arms crossed, jaw tight. His trap had failed, his pride wounded, but he still clung to the hope that Ethan would fail publicly. The gate creaked open. Ethan stepped inside. The stallion stood near the far end, muscles tense, nostrils flaring, but not angry. Alert, curious. Ethan didn't rush. He walked the perimeter slowly, letting the horse see him, feel his presence. Then he stopped, extended a hand, and waited. The crowd was silent. The stallion took a single step, then another. And then, without hesitation, it walked to Ethan and lowered its head. Gasps echoed. Ethan stroked its mane gently, whispered something only the horse could hear, and walked slowly toward the saddle resting on the fence. Everyone held their breath. Would he try? Would he ride it? Ethan took the saddle, approached the horse, and in a quiet moment of trust, placed it gently on the stallion's back. No rope, no fight, just consent. He tightened the cinch slowly, then placed one foot in the stirrup. The crowd leaned in, and in one smooth motion, he mounted. The stallion didn't buck. It stood still. Then, at Ethan's slightest cue, it began to walk, slowly, proudly, around the corral. People began clapping, cheering. Even Chase let out a whistle, but not everyone was happy. Tyler narrowed his eyes, lips pressed in a tight line. He turned to his closest friend. "We're not done." He motioned discreetly toward the far side of the corral, where one of the gates hadn't been fully secured. While everyone was watching the ride, Tyler slipped around and unlatched the gate, just enough to startle the horse if it got too close. He returned to the crowd as if nothing had happened. Inside the ring, Ethan guided the stallion near the open section. The horse flared its nostrils, sensed the shift, and began to tense. Ethan noticed immediately. His posture adjusted, his hands softened, his legs sent a calming signal through the saddle. "Easy," he whispered. The horse calmed. Instead of bolting toward the open gate, it turned with grace and continued the loop. Ethan knew. He looked toward the crowd, eyes scanning until they landed on Tyler. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan stared right through him. No anger, no accusation, just disappointment. Tyler looked away. The ride continued. Ethan guided the stallion into a soft trot, then a full loop around the arena. The crowd applauded louder now, astonished by the control, the harmony between man and beast. When Ethan finally dismounted, he patted the horse's neck and led it by hand back to the center. No rope, no resistance, only respect. The gate was closed behind them. The challenge was complete. Ethan didn't bow, he didn't speak. He simply nodded once and walked away, leaving the stallion standing tall under the Colorado sun, a living symbol of what trust, patience, and wisdom could accomplish. The crowd began to disperse, still talking in hushed tones, unsure whether they had witnessed training or something sacred. For most people, the show was over. Ethan had done the impossible, tamed the wild stallion without violence, force, or pride. The story would be told across ranches, in dusty coffee shops, and among riding instructors for years to come. But for Tyler Grayson, it wasn't enough. Humiliation had settled in his chest like a stone. His authority among the academy riders had crumbled. They no longer looked to him for guidance. They looked to the old man, and Tyler couldn't accept that. So when he saw Ethan brushing the stallion near the barn later that afternoon, he made his move. "You proved you can ride," Tyler said, arms folded. "But let's see what happens when the stakes are even." Ethan looked up slowly. Tyler continued. "A real rider doesn't just break a horse, he competes." "How about a race?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of race?" "A cross-ranch challenge. You and me. Tomorrow morning. Same path the academy uses for evaluation. Past the creek, around the ridge, and back through the East Trail." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Sarah, standing nearby, spoke up. "You don't have to do this. You already earned everyone's respect." But Ethan wasn't thinking about respect. He was thinking about a letter he had received the night before, an invitation from the Navy to speak at a memorial event in honor of a fallen teammate. He had turned it down without hesitation, until now. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from his past. Maybe Tyler's challenge was more than a petty test. Maybe it was a final step, one last lesson for himself and for those watching. He nodded. "Tomorrow, first light." Tyler grinned. "Hope you can still keep up." Word spread fast. By morning, the ranch was lined with spectators again. This wasn't about horses anymore, it was about legacy. Two men stood at the start, one young, brash, determined to prove a point. The other, quiet, focused, calm as a sunrise. Tyler mounted his sleek black gelding, a racing horse, trained and conditioned for speed. Ethan approached the stallion. Some muttered, wondering if it would obey again. But the moment he placed a hand on its mane, the horse stilled and lowered its head. He saddled up, mounted, and turned toward the trail without a word. The whistle blew. They were off. Tyler surged forward with speed and aggression, urging his horse faster at every turn. Ethan lagged slightly behind, not pushing the stallion, just guiding it with gentle cues, letting it find its rhythm. At the creek crossing, Tyler leapt the stream with a showy jump. Ethan slowed, let the stallion drink, then crossed with ease. Up the ridge, dust flying, Tyler turned back and shouted, "Too slow, old man!" But Ethan said nothing. He kept his eyes on the trail. Halfway through, Tyler began to fatigue. His horse was fast, but restless. Overexerted, he pushed it harder. Ethan waited. Then came the final stretch. The east trail was narrow and winding, sharp turns, low branches, and loose rocks. Tyler pushed too hard, too fast. His horse stumbled, nearly throwing him. Ethan caught up and passed him, not with speed, with control, with trust. The stallion moved as if it had always known the trail, responding to Ethan's every shift with grace. As they neared the finish line, the crowd rose to their feet. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. He crossed the line first. The ranch erupted, but Ethan didn't celebrate. He dismounted, whispered thanks to the stallion, and walked over to Tyler, who had just finished, panting and flushed. Ethan extended a hand. "You've got strength," he said, "but you're still learning how to use it." Tyler stared at him, breathing hard, and for the first time, he didn't sneer. He took Ethan's hand and nodded. The next morning, the arena had been cleared and prepped for a final event, an impromptu exhibition arranged by the academy instructors themselves. The race had changed everything. Respect had bloomed, not just for Ethan, but for what he represented. Control without domination, wisdom without arrogance. Yet there was one final moment that still lingered in the hearts of the young riders. Could Ethan do it again under pressure in front of everyone? The exhibition wasn't formal. There were no judges or ribbons, but everyone knew what it meant. It was Ethan's final mark, a public moment to showcase the transformation of the wild stallion. The stands filled. Riders, instructors, and ranch hands lined the fences. Even Mr. Dalton sat on the highest bench, arms crossed with a small smile on his face. Ethan stood beside the stallion in the center of the arena. No reins, no bit, just trust. Sarah whispered to herself, "This isn't just a horse story. This is a life story." Chase nodded beside her. "He's teaching us more than riding. He's teaching us who we should be." Ethan mounted the stallion slowly, letting the crowd settle into silence. He wore no showman's outfit, no polished boots, just his everyday flannel, dusty jeans, and the hat that had become iconic among the riders. Tyler stood near the edge of the arena, no longer sneering, just watching, quiet. The demonstration began. Ethan guided the stallion through a series of movements, with nothing more than slight shifts in his body. A gentle press of the knee, a tilt of his weight. The stallion moved with uncanny grace, circling, weaving, pausing on command. Then came the difficult part. Obstacles. Barrels were arranged, jumps positioned, narrow gates set up to test control and agility. Normally, a horse would need weeks to be trained for this. Ethan didn't hesitate. With the lightest cues, the stallion trotted toward the course. The crowd held its breath. First barrel, smooth turn. Second, tighter, faster. Over the jump, no falter. Through the narrow gate, perfect alignment. Every move was precise, every moment quiet. But then, Tyler stepped forward. His face was unreadable, and in a moment that shocked everyone, he opened the main gate of the arena wide. It was the same tactic he had tried before. A test, a temptation. The stallion, mid-run, now had a clear path to bolt, to freedom, to chaos, to undoing everything that had been built. Gasps echoed. A few shouted, but Ethan didn't react. He didn't try to stop the horse. He didn't pull or command. He trusted. The stallion saw the opening, paused, then turned, and kept running the course. Loyal, committed, transformed. The crowd erupted. People stood and clapped, many with tears in their eyes. Chase whooped with both fists in the air. Even the instructors shook their heads in disbelief. Tyler lowered his eyes. Ethan dismounted, stroked the stallion's mane, and walked to the center of the arena. He looked around, not proud but peaceful. He raised one hand and said, "This horse was never broken, he was understood." The arena fell quiet again. You don't force a wild heart. You earn its trust. That's how we lead. That's how we live. He turned and walked away, the stallion following without a lead, step by step. And just like that, the old man had shown everyone that strength is silent. Ethan Carter had just left the arena, the crowd still standing, hearts stirred by what they'd witnessed. But what happened next would be something no one, not even Ethan, saw coming. Tyler Grayson remained near the open gate, frozen in place. He hadn't expected the stallion to resist. He hadn't expected Ethan to trust it so completely. And most of all, he hadn't expected to feel what he now felt: shame. He turned and slowly walked away from the fence, head low. In the barn, Ethan unsaddled the stallion with the same quiet focus he always had. But this time, his hands moved more gently than ever, as if honoring the animal for choosing him, for trusting him. That's when Chase entered. "You've changed everything," he said. Ethan glanced up. "I used to think riding was about control, about showing the horse who's boss, but you made it look like a conversation." Ethan gave a small nod. "It always was." Chase paused. "We were wrong about you." Ethan didn't answer, because he didn't need to. Across the ranch, the young riders gathered in small clusters, talking not about Tyler or Chase or even the horse, but about Ethan, about how he had done it, about the lesson that had reached far beyond the arena. Then came the final shift. Tyler returned. He stood at the barn entrance, his shadow long in the golden afternoon sun. Ethan looked up, but didn't speak. "I was wrong," Tyler said, voice stiff but honest. "About you, about everything." A long silence stretched between them. Tyler stepped forward. "I thought strength was about being loud, about being first. You showed me it's about listening, about waiting." Ethan met his eyes. "Then you've already learned the most important part." Tyler lowered his head. "I sabotaged you." "Twice." Ethan's voice didn't rise. "I know." Tyler blinked. "You do?" Ethan nodded. "But the real question is, what will you do with what you've learned?" Tyler swallowed hard. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." Ethan extended his hand. Tyler took it, and with that single gesture, the story changed again. The next day, the academy held its final meeting before departure. Normally, the head trainer would give the closing speech, but this time all eyes turned to Ethan. He stepped forward slowly, hands in his pockets. "You came here to become riders," he began. "But if you leave here only knowing how to sit on a horse, you've missed the point." He glanced toward the stallion grazing nearby. "Riding teaches you about life, patience, timing, trust. Sometimes the only way to lead is to be still. Sometimes the best way to earn respect is to give it first." He paused. "Some of you came here trying to prove how strong you are. I hope you leave knowing that real strength doesn't need to be proven, it's lived." No one moved. Even the instructors sat motionless, their expressions soft. Ethan gave one last nod. "Ride well. Live better." When he turned to leave, the applause came. Not loud and wild, but respectful, deep, earned. Sarah stood nearby, notebook in hand. "You should write a book." Ethan chuckled. "I've written enough stories in scars." She smiled. "Still, people need to hear this." He paused, then said, "Maybe one day." As the academy riders loaded into vans, the stallion walked freely beside Ethan. No rope, no saddle, just walking. Chase waved from the van window. "See you next summer, Grizzly." Tyler lingered at the edge of the property. He looked back once more. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ethan raised a hand in farewell. And then, just as the sun began to set behind the ridge, Sarah turned to Ethan and asked, "Is this where your story ends?" He looked out over the fields, his gaze distant. "No," he said. "This is where it begins again." The summer came to a quiet end at Greenwood Ranch. The academy riders had returned to their cities, their routines, their competitions, but they left changed. What began as a lesson in horsemanship had become a deeper education in character. Tyler Grayson, once arrogant and untouchable, now wrote regularly to Ethan, asking for guidance, not just in riding, but in life. Chase had begun volunteering at a local riding school for underprivileged youth, teaching not with ego, but with empathy. The ripples of one man's quiet strength had begun reaching far beyond the corral. As for Ethan Carter, he returned to his daily rhythm, feeding, grooming, walking among the horses. But something inside him had shifted too. Where once he had buried the past under silence, he now wore it with quiet honor, not as a badge, but as a foundation. The stallion, once feared and labeled untamable, was now his closest companion, living proof that trust transforms everything. The legend of Ethan Grizzly Carter grew, not because he tamed a wild horse, but because he reminded a generation that dignity, patience, and quiet resolve still mattered. Sarah Collins closed her notebook for the last time that summer. Her article would go viral, yes, but more importantly, it would open the door for a bigger story, one that Ethan had only begun to tell. "There are more stories to share," she told him with a smile. He nodded, "One day at a time. So if you've followed this story to the end, let it remind you of this. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't ride in with noise. It walks with wisdom, speaks with gentleness, and acts when the time is right." If you want to hear more about Ethan and his incredible story, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next great adventure.